Hello, good morning,
Good morning.
and welcome, Professor Bonnie. How are you?
I'm good. And you?
I'm doing really good. So, welcome to you and welcome to everyone to this masterclass. Today, we are here with Bonnie, who will later on explain a little bit more about himself. But I just wanted to introduce briefly that we are going to talk about deliberative democracy in sub Saharan Africa, and more particularly the example of Panafricanism. So, we have entitled this session as From Social Mobilization to Political Advocacy. So, Bonnie, how about you share with us a little about your profile and your experience?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me and looking forward to the conversation. My name is Bonny Ibhawoh. I am a professor of international human rights here at McMaster University in Canada. My area of research interest is global human rights, but I'm also interested in African politics. I am the director of Participedia, which is the world's largest database of democratic innovation. And you can find the work we do if you just Google Participedia or type in participedia.net. And we have a research network and also a research platform that investigates deliberative democracies, the participation, and also civic inclusion processes around the world. Apart from my academic profile and my academic interests, I'm also currently the chair of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development, based in the office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. So I wear both an academic hat as a university professor, but also a practitioner hat as the director of Participedia, and also a policy hat as the chair of a United Nations expert mechanism.
You do have all the hats that we need for this class. So thank you so much for that introduction. I think we have a banner going right now. Unless we don't, that was a little too early. So maybe before the context, you may be asked, please, to introduce the goal of the session, please, Professor Bonnie.
Yeah, so the goal of this session is to explore deliberative democratic processes in Africa in the context of Pan-Africanism. So what I'm hoping we can have a conversation about today is, how does deliberative democracy manifest in Africa, and how has it manifested specifically in the context of Pan-Africanism? And of course, that would require that we explain what Pan-Africanism means and its many manifestations. So I'm hoping to have a conversation first about the essence of democracy in the African context, and then secondly, how these democratic processes and principles relating particularly to deliberative democracy are manifesting, focusing on some of the successes of these processes, but also focusing on the challenges of these processes. I would also be bringing a historical angle because to understand the state of democracy in Africa today, you have to go a bit back to the history. You cannot understand the present political context without the historical context. So I will provide a bit of historical context of Pan-Africanism and also some discussion of where things stand today in terms of democracy and deliberative processes.
Thank you so much for the context and also for bringing up the how important it is to have this historical angle that you mentioned. I think it's something that a lot of people working in political science lack, and so I think this will be, in fact, very interesting. Thank you, Professor Bonny. How about we go straight in the matter? And I have, as you know, a first question for you, which is when and why Pan-Africanism was. Oh, we have first a video of context, I think. This is really tricky, this whole StreamYard thing. So thank you so much for being patient with us. So let's go. All right, we have all the team working in the design in the back end, so it's really important to respect that also. So yeah, the first question that you had is when and why Pan-Africanism was born. Or yes, if you want to continue or pursue the structure that you first mentioned, please do and go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So this is why I think a historical context to this conversation is very important to understand where and when Pan-Africanism was born. We need to go back to the colonial context in Africa. So Pan-Africanism is a political, social, and cultural movement that emerged in the 20th century in response to colonialism, to racism, and to the marginalization of Africa in the global political economy. So Pan-Africanism was a response to these challenges to African people and the African continent. And the philosophy behind Pan-Africanism is a very simple one, and it is centered on unity, solidarity, self-determination, political empowerment, and economic development. So if you think about Pan-Africanism, it is really a movement that aims to unify Africans and peoples of African descent. And I think this is an important part of the Pan-Africanist philosophy, that it is not just about uniting Africa, but also about uniting Africa, Africans, and peoples of African descent. So whether they are in the Caribbean or in Latin America or in Europe or in Asia, the philosophy of Pan-Africanism really was to bring together Africans in a way that provides a platform for promoting African values, African interests, and promoting self-determination. The original initiative for the Pan-Africanist movement started in the Caribbean. Interestingly, not in Africa, because one of the earliest Pan-Africanist philosopher and activist was Marcus Garvey, the Jamaican intellectual and activist who first articulated the notion of Pan-Africanism. And of course, these ideas spread to the United States and to Africa. And so Pan-Africanism became an important part of the nationalist movement for independence in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in Africa. It became a framework for kind of united action to ensure political development, political self-determination, but also social and economic empowerment. So that briefly is the essence of Pan-Africanism, a movement that emerged in response to colonialism and the marginalization of Africa with the intent of empowering Africans and people of African descent to have more political, social, and economic control over their own affairs.
I already know that people, when they will see this, will have a million questions come up with it to their minds. So I'm gonna ask one of them. It's where do you think Pan-Africanism and this social movement, where all the African countries have been getting together, is leading to? What does the future looks like in all this picture that you just drew for us?
Yes, so Pan Africanism, like I said before, has many dimensions. You can think about Pan Africanism as a political movement, you can think about it as a social movement, you can think about it as an economic movement, but you can also think about it as a cultural movement. So, if you think about Pan Africanism as a cultural movement, for instance, you can see the idea of a Pan African identity, for example, in the lyrics of the famous reggae musician Bob Marley. So, if you listen to some of Bob Marley's lyrics, his songs like Africa Unite, or another song that is very popular called War. If you're familiar with the lyrics of War, Bob Marley is saying there, for instance, until the philosophy that holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently dismantled and abandoned, everywhere there will be war until there's no longer first class or second class citizen of any nation. Everywhere there'll be war. And a lot of people do not realize that the lyrics of Bob Marley actually come out of a speech made by the Emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, at the United Nations in 1963. And this was a Pan Africanist call. So Pan Africanism has really resonated as a cultural movement. But let me go to the question of Pan Africanism as a political movement. So, the strongest manifestation of Pan Africanism as a political movement is the establishment of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in the 1960s. So, this is the organization for all African states that brings all African countries together. And in fact, some non Africa diasporic states or states with majority of people of African descent in the Caribbean are honorary members of the African Organization of African Unity. Now, that organization has now changed to become known as the African Union, just like you have the European Union. It's based in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And the African Union has a mandate to push for the political unity of Africa. It also has a mandate to achieve the economic and social empowerment of the continent. And it has a number of initiatives that are all aimed at creating more political connections and economic solidarities across Africa. It is increasingly working to ensure that African countries speak with one voice, particularly on matters of international trade, for instance, on matters of international geopolitics, for instance, on matter of global financing, for instance. So that is really the essence of the political manifestation of Pan-Africanism. But like I said before, there are also cultural, social, and economic manifestations of Pan-Africanism.
Thank you, Professor. As you mentioned, I will maybe point that out that you said there are multiple dimensions to Pan Africanism. So one of them is actually a political one, and with the matter of bringing people together in Africa, not only in the economical matters or the social matters, but also politically. As you know, we are here talking about deliberative democracy, and that is our interest. So, how about you tell us a little bit about how or not deliberative democracy can bringing people together in Africa?
So that's a very good question. And I think the answer that I can give to that question is that Pan Africanism is founded on deliberation. The essence of Pan Africanism is consensus building. It is trying to have people working together to reach a common cause. So, by deliberative democracy, when political scientists and political theorists talk about deliberative democracy, we are often talking about processes that allow for consensus building beyond the traditional, electoral mechanisms that we associate with democracy, like voting and all of that. Deliberative democracy often connotes those processes that allow for deliberation, for civic inclusion, for the expansion of ideas about governance within the public space. So those really were the core elements of Pan-Africanism when it first started. Because if you recall, as I mentioned earlier, Pan-Africanism emerged as a reaction to colonialism and the authoritarianism and oppression of colonialism. So it was very important for the early leaders of the Pan-Africanist movement to create spaces for colonized people in Africa and marginalized peoples of African descent, Black people in the diaspora, to deliberate on how to come together, on how to forge a common cause. So some of the early initiatives that led to the establishment of the Pan-Africanist movement were the Pan-African Congresses. So these were congresses organized. I think one was organized in London. A few of them were organized in Africa. But these were deliberative processes that brought together African leaders from across the continent to deliberate on how to create a united front in opposition to colonialism. The same spirit of deliberation has continued in the post colonial era. The African Union that I just talked about, it's an essentially deliberative platform where African leaders come together to try and address common needs across the continent. Many of these are elected leaders, but there's also a body called the African Parliament, which is a deliberative body within the auspices of the African Union that allows selected African leaders, community leaders, non governmental organizations, academics to come together to address specific questions relating to African unity, African empowerment, and some of the challenges of the continent. So, what I'm trying to say here is that deliberation is essential to these processes. And I would argue that deliberative democracy it's necessary to actualize, to achieve some of the goals of Pan-Africanism. Because Africa, it's a very diverse continent, as some of you may know. I know in the media, Africa tends to be treated as one country, but we always emphasize that Africa is 52 countries, very diverse countries with various languages, various people. And so if you're thinking about achieving unity and consensus among such a diverse continent, it is important that you have deliberative spaces that allow for these diverse voices to be represented, to be articulated. And so I would argue that not only has deliberative processes and deliberative democracy been crucial to the development of the Pan-Africanist movement, I would even argue that deliberative democracy is essential to achieving the goals of the Pan-Africanist movement, which is unity, which is continental empowerment, which is self-determination. And I give you a classic example, climate crisis, for instance. The discussion about the solution to the climate crisis in Africa, as it is elsewhere in the world, has to be a deliberative process. So the Pan-Africanist approach to the climate crisis, which the African Union is leading right now, is of necessity a deliberative process where citizens, not just political leaders, but citizens, political leaders, NGOs, academics, policymakers are coming together to think through ways of addressing this big global crisis of climate change. So I will say that deliberative democracy is integral to the Pan-Africanist idea and the Pan-Africanist movement.
You went directly where I was heading to with my next question. So, that now that you mentioned that deliberative democracy is talking about those subjects such as climate change, what experience have existed in African countries, these 52 countries that you mentioned, so far on citizens' assemblies or bottom up citizen processes on deliberative democracy on climate change that you maybe can give us some examples on, or some ideas, share some thoughts or what have happened there?
Yeah, good question. So I can give you many examples of deliberative democratic processes in Africa, in the continent, but I want to focus on two or three of them that I think are really important because very often when we think about deliberative democracy and deliberative spaces, we often think about particular tradition and particular processes. You mentioned participatory budgeting, citizens assembly. And these are very common processes that are being used around the world. But when I talk about deliberative democratic process in Africa, I also try to talk about some of these processes that are unique to Africa, that are Africa's contributions, if you like, to the theorization of democracy, to the deliberative democratic process. So let me start with a common one, the one that I know many people will be familiar with, participatory budgeting, for instance. So participatory budgeting has been used in many countries around Africa, in situations where resources are scarce, in resource-constrained environment. Uh, Participatory budgeting has been used as a way of bringing citizens' voices into governance to decide how scarce resources are managed. So, I mean, there's been participatory budgeting initiatives in Kenya recently, for example. Kenya had a number of participatory budgeting sessions in that country. Questions of land reform, for instance. In Uganda in 2017, Uganda had a citizen assembly centered on land reform and land use and how land was going to be allocated in the country. So this was something that the government and non-governmental organizations, they facilitated kind of citizen assembly to address these issues. But these are all initiatives at the country level, at a national level. At a continental level, which is where Pan-Africanism comes in again, you've also had some very innovative deliberative democratic processes. And I'll give you one example of that. The African Union Agenda 2063. So the African Union has developed an agenda for what the expectation is for the continent by 2063. Think about it like the Sustainable Development Goals, which is Agenda 2030, the global ambition of development for the year 2030. So the African Union has an equivalent of that, which is called the African Union Agenda 2063. And much of the development of this agenda has been through a very deliberative process. So citizens and the political leaders and non-governmental organizations have come together within the framework of the African Union to discuss this process, either the economic vision for Africa and how to achieve that vision. But there's another form of deliberative democracy that you often do not hear about in the debates and the scholarship about deliberative democracy. In fact, I will be surprised if any of your textbooks on deliberative democracy even mentions this as a deliberative democracy process. And that is truth and reconciliation commissions. In our project, the Participedia project, we're beginning to argue that truth commissions are essential deliberative processes in post-conflict and post-authoritarian societies. Scholars of Latin America will be very familiar with the role of truth commissions in Chile, in Colombia right now, and in many countries in Latin America, in trying to move societies from an authoritarian rule or a situation of conflict, as in Colombia, to a situation of democracy and peace. But very often, truth commissions or truth and reconciliation commissions, we think about them as transitional justice mechanisms. And they are transitional justice mechanisms, but we argue in Participedia that they are also deliberative democratic processes, particularly for post-conflict societies, for transitioning states. So when we talk about deliberative democracy in Africa, my project in Participedia, we are trying to put Truth and Reconciliation Commission front and center as an important democratic space, deliberative democratic space, because it has all the elements of your classic definition of deliberative democracy. They are quasi-judicial organizations set up to investigate human rights abuses. They have open hearing, often public hearing. They allow citizens to come to these hearings to tell their stories about abuse and about violations. There are opportunities for debates and deliberation about what happened and how to solve those problems. At the end of the day, the Truth Commission publishes a report that is expected to be implemented by government. And so we are arguing that when we think about deliberative democracies in the global South, we have to go beyond the traditional examples that we are familiar with, citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, and all of this. But we have to also think about the creative ways that peoples in the global South, peoples and societies that have weak democracies, that are coming out of conflict, that are coming out of an authoritarian situation, are also creating unique spaces for deliberative democracy. And I think that is the challenge we have as scholars, that we have to reimagine deliberative democracy beyond the traditional models that we're familiar with.
I applaud that idea because we have been working in deliberative democracy in the global South, but one of the most challenging problems that we have faced so far is that we try to bring those models to the South, to the global South, and they fail sometimes. And we wonder why they fail, because we do understand that there are new and creative ways to do deliberation in the global South, and it is so important to recognize also them and to say that not all the mechanisms that do deliberation call themselves as deliberative. So
Yes.
there is a switch to make in that too.
Yes.
So thank you so much for sharing that, Professor Ibhawoh. I have a next question about how can we ensure that all this engagement that we actually get to do while we put people together and they deliberate and they come to conclusions and they give those conclusions to the state, how can we ensure that this will be actual a matter of change and that there will be something happening after that?
Yes, a very good question. What is the impact of deliberative democracy? How can deliberative processes be impactful. And I like the point you just made about the need for those of us who work on deliberative democracy in the global south to think outside the box, to think about how local people are innovating in the democratic space. They may not describe what they do in terms of deliberation or even democracy, but we as scholars should be able to recognize it and validate these processes as deliberative democratic initiatives. And this is exactly what our project here, Participedia, is committed to. So we have documented over 3,000 cases of local people coming together to create spaces for voicing their opinions, to be engaged in governance. Sometimes we call it democratic innovation. Sometimes we call it deliberative democracy. But sometimes we don't even use the D word. We don't even talk about democracy. We say it's civic inclusion. We say it is public participation because we also have to be cognizant of how local people understand their processes. And we have to be respectful of how those processes are understood and defined by the local people themselves. So, to come back to your question, how do we make sure it is impactful? I do not believe that these deliberative processes have to be funneled to the government or through the state to be effective. In an ideal world, that is what will happen. And I'll give you the example of the Truth Commission. Truth Commissions are often established by the government to investigate a human rights abuse. And then at the end of the day, they write a big report, they submit it to the government. And in many of the cases we've looked at, the government does not implement it. And so you wonder what was the point of the whole Truth Commission process. So I am arguing for increasingly what I call direct action arising from deliberative process. And I'll give you an example of that. So one of the deliberative processes that we've been involved with recently is called the Global Citizen Assembly for Climate Change. And this is a body that meets, it is a coalition of citizens around the world that meets parallel to the United Nations climate conferences. So every time the UN climate conferences meet, whether it's COP26 or I think COP27 now in Abu Dhabi, the Global Citizen Assembly meets in parallel to these official UN state-sanctioned uh, conferences. And they come up with their own declaration. At the last COP conference in 26, these organizations, these Global Citizen Assembly, came up with what it called the People's Declaration on Climate Change. And it is born out of the idea that sometimes citizens have to work parallel to the state to be effective. In other words, deliberative processes that are not just designed to feed into state processes, but are also designed to put pressure on state processes, put pressure on multilateral organizations, put pressure on international organizations to make change happen independent of the state process. So that is where I see a lot of interest. That is where I see a lot of possibilities. Citizen led deliberative democratic processes that are designed to be actionable within the civic realm, whether it is in terms of complementing state initiative, but also just going it alone. And I'll give you one final example of how I have seen that work in my area of international human rights. And those are truth commissions that have been established by local people. We call them grassroots truth commission. When the state is unwilling or unable to establish a truth commission to investigate the roots of gross human rights violation or to bring those who have been responsible for the violation to account, Local people have taken it upon themselves to organize their own truth commission. Yes, it does not have the power of the state, it cannot impose sanctions, but it has been effective in galvanizing public opinion to draw attention to gross human rights violation and to put pressure on international organizations like the United Nations to take action where the state has failed to take action. This is how I think deliberative democratic processes or civic inclusion processes can be most effective.
Thank you, Professor. So we have a couple of questions to go through before we close this master class. And now that you mentioned the truth commissions and that you mentioned all the human rights that are involved in the conflict, how can deliberative democracy support political and human rights? And how to reduce the asymmetry of power between citizens and governments in Africa? We do know the examples of truth commissions that you mentioned, but are there other ways that you haven't brought so far?
Yes, so this is a very good question, and this is where I would really urge those who are participating in this masterclass to take the time to visit our project website, participedia.net, and you can get there just by typing Participedia on Google. Now, Participedia, if I must explain this, it's kind of Wikipedia for deliberative democracy or democratic innovation. Like I said earlier, we have compiled over 3,000 cases from around the world of how local people, often very local people, are mobilizing through deliberative processes to have a voice in governance, to effect political change, to demand economic reform, or to demand social inclusion. Uh, Participedia has over 3,000 cases now, but we also have method entries where we are researching, bringing a methodology to understanding how the communities do this. We're not just interested in looking at the case studies and saying, okay, this is how this community has dealt with this, but we are also looking at how are the processes happening and what can communities from around the world learn from each other. So for instance, a community in Colombia that is fighting against multinational corporations trying to seize their land or take their land for industrial use without compensation. And they're mobilizing and trying to draw on international law to enhance their cause. Well, what can that community learn from another community in Kenya that has done this and done this successfully? So the goal of Participedia is really to provide a knowledge sharing platform where organizations, NGOs, academics can learn from each other about how to make deliberative democratic processes effective and efficient. And I'll give you an example again, outside of human rights, of how Participedia has been instrumental in helping to make sure that these processes are actionable, that they actually bring about change. So, for instance, at the height of COVID pandemic, if you all remember during COVID, there was total lockdown all over the world. Uh, Most countries locked down. The researchers couldn't do any research. There were questions about access of vaccines. We just couldn't understand this pandemic. But yet, the United Nations Development Agency, UNDP, and many United Nations organizations wanted real time data on how local people are mobilizing to cope with the pandemic, either in terms of mobilizing to ensure that the government provides them with vaccines, or how they were mobilizing to ensure that the government provides them with economic support at a time where most people could not work and had no income. we wanted to know how local people were deliberating to address the challenges of COVID. And Participedia provided us a window into how they were doing this. Because Participedia is a crowdsourced platform, it is crowdsourced. Anybody can go there and do your research and write a case. We have a methodology there that anyone can register and upload a case. So what we had was that some of the very first research on how local communities were responding to COVID-19 pandemic came from Participedia, because local people were using their cell phones to take pictures and record what was happening in their local community relating to COVID and uploading it to Participedia. And we were able to aggregate all that information very quickly, almost in real time, to create what we call the Participedia COVID-19 civic engagement platform collection. And if you go to the website, you'll find that there. And so this became a resource, one of the earliest resources that international agencies, researchers like myself, NGOs could draw upon to begin to shape public policy on COVID-19, either in terms of vaccine access and distribution, or in economic response, or in health responses to COVID. So my answer to that question is that technology provides an opportunity, and I think this is why DemoReset is also a great initiative. Technology and research that we are doing provides an opportunity for amplifying these voices, so that it's not just what is happening at the local level, but that somehow these activities are elevated to the level where researchers and policymakers can draw on them to push for change. So these are some of the ways that I think that these processes can be used to effect real change in our societies.
Thank you, Professor. I think that I didn't stop and say that before, and I regret it. And it's thank you on behalf of all deliberative democracy practitioners and researchers, and for all the work and magnificent results that you have done in Participedia. It is a really it is a mind gold, and we really appreciate everything you have done. So thank you so much for your answer as well, and for answering all those questions for this masterclass. So in this moment, I will close this content section, and now we have a little video, and then we will jump into the conclusions. How about that?
That's great.
Great. All right. So we asked you to prepare 3 conclusions that you wanted to share with the people here following your masterclass. So let's jump into that.
Yes, so 3 quick conclusions that I've already kind of alluded to in my talk on questions of deliberative democracy. The first one is an academic one, and it is to expand the conceptual and theoretical framework. This is very important for those of us who work in the global south, because for very long, and I see this very much in my field of human rights, is that the established canonical works on deliberative democracy, on human rights, were developed within the Western European Enlightenment tradition, whether you're thinking about liberal democracy or you're thinking about human rights and the notion of universalism. Many of these ideas, the foundational concepts, came out of the Western intellectual tradition. And that is okay because it has value. But we are in an era now where there's a lot of talk about decolonization, decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing epistemology, and expanding the framework of analysis. and it doesn't contradict the established canons, because I think those foundational works are still useful. But in order to meet the challenges of today, we need to expand our conceptual and theoretical horizons. So my first takeaway is that we, as scholars of democracy and as scholars, particularly of deliberative democracy, we have to think about conceptual expansion. And that is what we're doing in Participedia, to think beyond the traditional definitions of deliberative democracy, to study how processes of civic inclusion and public participation manifest at local level, and to think about how our understanding of those local level practices can inform the theory. So we strengthen the theory by drawing on that. So that is the first thing that I will take away, that we think about not just how to apply concepts to locals, but also how local ideas shape concepts and theories. The second point that I would emphasize is the need to bring theory and practice together. That and this means working with practitioners. I said at the beginning of my talk that I wear several hats. I am an academic, I'm a professor in a university. I am the director of Participedia, that allows me to do a lot of practitioner work. But I'm also a global policymaker at the United Nations. But very often I find that when I'm speaking at these very three forums, I use different languages. I'm talking to three separate audiences. And very often, these three groups do not speak to each other. In academia, we want very regimented processes of research and peer review, and we write big books that are not useful to practitioners. Practitioners want very practical documents they can use in the field of development or human rights or democracy. And at the United Nations, there are big debates about policy. So my second advice is that we should do our research, whether from a policy or practical perspective or academic perspective, in ways that strives to bridge the divide, that speaks to all these constituencies, because that is the only way we can make a real impact. If we continue to speak in silos, then we're not going to have the kind of impact that we have. And then finally, and this is a personal and important one for me, that we are living in an age where there is a reversal of democracy. Democracy is facing a crisis, a big existential crisis. And when I say democracy is facing a crisis, I'm not just talking about the global south, because when you talk about crisis of democracy, people often talk about, the new or emerging democracies in the global south, Latin America, Africa, and the south. But I'm also talking about the West, the established industrial democracies. We see today a big challenge to democracy in established global north, whether you're talking about nationalist populism, reactionary nationalist populism in Western democracy, talking about the toxic forms of digital communication that are challenging election. In one of the most established democratic countries in the world, the United States, elections are now being contested, and elections are now being doubted. Electoral processes are being questioned in ways that many of us didn't think would be possible. So, how do we respond to these challenges of democracy? And my suggestion is that there has to be a reinvention of democracy. There has to be a reimagining of democracy. In some ways, we need what we describe as, and some of you may be familiar with this concept, radical democracy. A new form of democracy that challenges the norms, that takes us back to the fundamentals of democracy, which is civic inclusion, which is amplifying the voices of marginalized people, which is ensuring that everyone has a seat at the table in how societies are governed. Also, radical democracy implies that majority rule does not become majority tyranny, that the rule of the majority does not become the tyranny of the majority, and that the minorities are protected, and that vulnerable groups are protected, and that their voices continue to be heard. And this is why human rights is important, that even in a democratic setting, we must continue to pay attention to the fundamental principles of human rights. Because without human rights to check the tyranny of the majority, democracy is in peril. And so those are my three recommendations, that we expand conceptual and theoretical framework, that we really push for a rethinking of democracy, and then we amplify the voices of the most vulnerable in a society in such a way that democracy ultimately serves everyone, not just the privileged few.
It really has been incredibly humbling and inspiring listening to you today, Professor Bonnie. I just wanted to point up and stress on that idea of building those bridges between all those different hats that you wear, and that theory should meet always practice and vice versa. So it is really important that we produce all the knowledge that we need in order to enhance all those two ways that we already have. Thank you so much for everything that you shared with us today. I hope that, well, yeah, tonight, it depends on where you are. I hope that a lot of people will get to see this masterclass that is already being live on YouTube too. So thank you so much for your time, for everything that you shared, and I hope that we will keep on working together as a team on deliberative democracy in the global south.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Have a nice rest of your day.
You too. Goodbye.